Welcome to Mana's Seal YouTube channel. The previous video link is on the description box or on the top right card. Volume 16, The Half-Elf Godkin. The twins were the main characters this time. Right now Ains was just an insignificant side character in this play. The problem lied in overemphasizing that sort of minor role. Yet, the need to call attention to his presence, to a certain degree, would probably appear before long. He intended on that course of action, anyways, in order to diminish Aura's role of a hero down to a mere child, when the time was appropriate. A dark elf in front of him walked toward him. They would occasionally turn their gaze towards Ains, but that was nothing more than the gaze you would turn to a person you were crossing paths with. Perfect. Let's use that as part of my disguise. Through his use of perfect unknowable, he knew the general layout of the village, but they had established that this was the first time Aura's uncle had come here. He would probably appear suspicious if he were to walk around like he was too familiar with the place. Of course, he could make any number of excuses in that case. For example, Aura had told him, and so on. However, intentionally making excuses and appearing suspicious to them were both trouble smacks. He wouldn't do a single thing that would raise their wariness of him, and if that were the case... excuse me. Oh, yes. Can I help you with something? He just had to ask one of the dark elves that were around there. Yes. I heard about it from my niece, but as I understand it, there is a brilliant pharmacist who is the chief pharmacist of this village, yes. I would like to pay him a visit, so could you point me in the direction of his elf tree? They answered Ains's question honestly, without any suspicion or concealment. Ains thanked the dark elf and headed in the direction they had told him to the elf tree that Ains already knew about. Along the way, he saw the sight of a dark elf man with his hands sticking out towards the ground underneath a tree. Wondering what he was doing, Ains stopped. As he watched, the earth bulged, started moving, and a lump of soil climbed up the trunk, as if it were slime. It resembled the earth surge spell that Mare used, but it was different in various senses of the word. Whether it be domestic magic or the divine type magic of the druids, it wasn't the magic of Yggdrasil, but probably something they had developed over the course of their lives. The lump of dirt conformed to the man's manipulation without delay, and climbed to the top of the tree, which Ains couldn't see from where he stood. That was probably the soil the dark elves used in their household vegetable gardens. The dark elves had vegetable gardens using planters that they built either inside or on top of the trees. Even though the planters themselves were made from the trees, he had wondered how they had transported the soil up to them. This seemed to be the answer to that. Ains was satisfied that he was able to see something interesting, and once again made his way towards his destination. The elf tree he was directed toward was a rather imposing and thick one. It might possibly be the thickest in the village, as expected of the home of the chief pharmacist, an influential man in the village. And on top of that, there was quite a distance between it and the other elf trees around it. This was probably done so there wouldn't be any harm caused to those around it, even if toxic substances were produced during the mixing process. Even if they were high level with consequently enhanced immune systems pharmacists who could withstand the poisons that were produced, it wasn't necessarily the case that children, the sick, or other sorts of people, without that kind of resilience, would be able to withstand it. And maybe in addition to that, it might also be to prevent the theft of information. From Ains's perspective, he truly could empathize with the idea of monopolizing information, both in the sense of protecting one's vested interests, and in the sense of wanting to avoid the trouble it would cause if they were stolen. Everyone knew that a medicine could become a poison if you misjudged the dosage. So, would the person who willfully stole that information be able to make proper medicine? Probably not. If an inferior imitation appeared on the market, and victims of it emerged, then even the pharmacist who originally created the medicine would be suspected. In short, that's what this was. Hello, do you mind if I come in? Ains called out into the interior of the elf tree. There was no reply. Knocking on the trunk of the elf tree, he called out one more time. When he strained his ears, he could hear the sound of something being rubbed and scraped together. If you'll pardon the intrusion. Ains just walked in of his own accord. Then, he immediately caught sight of the back of a slightly plump male dark elf. Although it could be due to a lack of exercise, this sort of physique was probably the result of having food delivered that was commensurate with having a prominent high-status job. First of all, it was probably safe to assume that this wasn't an apprentice, but was indeed the master of this house, the chief pharmacist. Sitting on the floor and turned towards a low-sitting desk, the pharmacist single-mindedly rotated his arm. On the desk were an ordinary mortar and pestle, a Yajin mortar and pestle, and other rudimentary tools. The pots on the shelves probably had herbal medicines inside them. Herbs and plants that appeared to be medicinal hung down from the ceiling. The odor of bitter medicines and green grass mixed together and flooded into Ains's nasal cavity, reminding him of Inferia and his grandmother's workshop. The dark elves possessed a far greater sense of hearing than humans did. Be that as it may, it would only be slightly better compared to humans, so Ains had no way of distinguishing whether the chief pharmacist had noticed, but dared to ignore him, or whether he hadn't noticed him because he was so focused on his work. Ains called out to him once more. "Excuse me. Do you have a moment?" There the chief pharmacist stopped his hand that was grinding for the first time and looked over his shoulder, sending Ains a reproachful look and knitting his eyebrows. I see. That face-concealing cloth. If I'm not mistaken, you're that man from the same place as that girl who came here a little while ago. An arcane-type magic caster, was it? Yes, that's right. It seems that you are already well informed about me. When Ains tried to remove the cloth, the chief pharmacist spoke. That won't be necessary. It is the custom of your tribe, right? There's no need to show me your face. It's not like I care about what you look like anyway. You're fine as you are now. I accept your greeting. Okay. Well then, if you're done here, please go home. I'm busy. Grumbling, that was all he said. As if he had lost interest, his gaze returned to the desk. It felt like there was a thick border around that surly attitude. Despite that, Ains was relieved. This sort of person wore their heart on their sleeve and spoke candidly. If they straight up said, "You're bothering me, so get out," to get rid of him, then from there, even if Ains were to display his abilities as a salesman, it would be extremely difficult to get them to look at him. However, he hadn't said anything like that. In other words, it meant that there was still room to get him to listen to what Ains had to say. While watching the back of the chief pharmacist as he was grabbing the mortar and pestle, Ains asked him the question. "What is it that you are making right now? What's it matter to you?" There was some harshness in his words. He didn't have time for useless conversations. "Is that right?" Ains answered. After he let some time pass by, he then asked, "First, I would like to ask you about what medicinal herbs you use to cure stomachache in this village. Is it cayenne peel or is it candian root?" The chief pharmacist's hand suddenly stopped. Just as he did a short while ago, he twisted his neck and looked over his shoulder to stare at Ains a second time. "Could you wait for a bit?" "Yes, of course." The chief pharmacist turned his back on Ains again and started grinding once more. However, even from behind, Ains could tell that his attitude had changed a little. It seemed that the basics of the salesman's art of conversation, searching for a shared topic, like interests or hometown, with the person you're talking to, from his time as Suzuki Satori, had been useful. Hypothetically, consider the difference between a salesperson you had no common ground with versus someone with the same interests. If the contents of what they're peddling, its appearance, price, windows of delivery, payment, and so on were all the same, then a business contact would usually choose the latter. Since the chief pharmacist seemed to be a person who was passionate about their work, he had guessed the topic of medicines would be the best one to curry favor with him. "I was just making it right now. Cayenne doesn't grow around here. That's why we use the zen leaves. As you might know, when you grind up a zen leaves, their efficacy quickly fades. However, it is also problematic if the speed of the grinding is too fast, and they heat up." When he had finished grinding them enough, he poured a gooey liquid into the mortar. This liquid is a secretion that comes from cutting into the near tree. By mixing it with this, there will be no change in efficacy. That being said, one more step is necessary because using it like this weakens its efficacy. The chief pharmacist once again turned to Ains and unreservedly scrutinized him from head to toe. His nose then moved like he was sniffing for something, after which he frowned. "There's no smell. Hey, show me your hands." Ains did as he was told and showed him his hands. Because Ains more or less knew what he wanted to say, he showed him the backs of his hands, his fingers. For the time being, the chief pharmacist shouldn't be able to touch him with the distance between them. Ains thought about what to do if the chief pharmacist were to approach him and search for the words to explain it away. The smell of crushed plants, if you're a pharmacist, that smell that would naturally be soaked into your body, the residue that would stain your fingers, isn't there. "I heard you were an arcane-type magic caster, but does this mean you're performing the techniques of the pharmacist in some other way?" Since he had planned on visiting this place, he could have crushed some medicinal herbs to cloak his body in their scent beforehand and gain the chief pharmacist's trust. On top of that, because Ains's hands were just illusions, it was possible to make them hands the chief pharmacist would approve of. However, there were two reasons Ains hadn't done those things. The first one was because the Bear family wasn't like that. Certainly, that smell would drift out while they were working, and the smell that permeated their workshop and work clothes was quite intense. However, it wasn't as if they were constantly cloaked in that smell. If anything, Inferia and the rest of them seemed to be very concerned about nothing other than deodorizing themselves. Of course, that might just be the Bear family, but when faking one's identity, your words and actions would be more natural by using a real person as a reference. You could finish without having to fret over every single word or comment and create lies. The other reason was because Ains was totally ignorant about herbal medicine. Even if he rubbed on the smells, changed the color of his fingers, and assumed the identity of a pharmacist's apprentice, he would probably be found out when the chief pharmacist asked him about dosing, as he would not be able to give a straight answer.